Specifically, I was asked to talk about tips for working with students with disabilities, and I have a wealth of experience that I bring to this topic, a wealth of knowledge that I bring to this topic, and that is all available to you. And so what I'm hoping is as we go through, if something makes you think of, oh gosh, how would that work in this situation, or I've had a student like this, any sort of questions. I encourage questions as I go along. If I don't cover every single slide, I'm good with that. And we will make this available to you electronically, so anything that I miss saying, you'll be able to pick up that way. So I want to start out by kind of giving you a little bit of a context to put this framework in. When I'm speaking, I will be speaking kind of mostly toward working with students, but just know that everything that I'm talking about today applies not just to working with students, so all of these laws apply equally to employees as they do to students. And so if you are, for instance, an admin assistant who's maybe sending out official campus emails, you need this information just as much as the faculty do, just as much as the administrators do. So I am really speaking to everybody. So I want to start out just really to address a big issue that does sometimes come up, and that's the issue of academic freedom. I've had faculty members say, well, this impacts my academic freedom. Really, if you look up what academic freedom is all about, academic freedom is part of the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech. So that is what academic freedom is about. It is about the fact that you don't want anyone else telling you the proper way to talk about your discipline, whatever it might be. You have the academic freedom to teach it in a way, with your department chairs and your other faculty members in your department talking about how you're going to do this. That is up to you guys. What we're saying is whatever medium, whatever modality, whatever container, if you will, that you're putting that information inside of, that's what needs to be accessible. That's what needs to be something that every one of your students can open and get inside of. We want them to get the information that you're teaching, and we want everybody to have that same availability, that same access to that information. And of course, it's also the law. But beyond that, it is not only the right thing to do, but you're going to find as we go along, it's good pedagogy, or as somebody said, I was supposed to say, I think it's andragogy, which is more appropriate for adults. Some of you in education might be aware of that, because I guess pedagogy assumes that you don't bring any personal experience necessarily to the table, whereas with adults, certainly all of our adults do bring quite a lot to the table. Now, I want to make it clear that access is not hard. I remember a colleague having a discussion with a faculty member, and this was a faculty member who was putting up their own web page. And literally, they must have spent 20 minutes arguing about why this was the right thing to do, blah, 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 blah. And finally, my colleague got so frustrated, and he just said to the person, okay, let's do it. I'm going to walk you through it. We're going to do it like now. It took less than 5 minutes. So literally, the person had spent 5 times as long arguing about it as it actually took to do it. And you're going to find that with accessibility. I'm not quite sure why people think that it's going to be so hard. It's really not. It's really very simple. And I'm going to give you more information on that as we go along. So really what we're talking about is as you are creating your course materials, think about accessibility as you're in that creation phase, as you're writing that email, as you're putting that flyer together. If you think about it at that phase, it really is a very natural process. It is not difficult to do at all. And I've had so many people say to me after they go through my courses on, for instance, how to create a Word document that's accessible, how to create a PDF that's accessible, or a PowerPoint that's accessible, they'll come up afterwards and they'll say, this is just good design. Everything that you're talking about is just good design. Well, yes, it is, because really, this is all part of that universal design idea of making something that works for the people who have the most difficulty accessing it. Is going to make it work well for everyone. And that, at the heart, is what universal design is all about. What is hard is retrofitting. So, I don't know how many of you like to do craft sort of things, but I grew up in a very rural area. I grew up on an apple orchard, and I was part of 4-H, which some of you might be familiar with. I learned to do cooking and sewing and all of those sort of household kinds of things. And not that long ago, I was working on a project, and I got to step 12 in the sewing project, and I thought, this is not going together right? What's going on here? Some of you know this feeling. And I went back and looked at the instructions, because of course we all read the instructions so carefully. Yeah, I had made a mistake about step 6, and then you have the decision to make. Do I tear it all apart, or does it go into the closet of shame? And the closet of shame is where all of those projects, and of course all of the, it doesn't save you any money, right? You guys who do craft projects, you know, it's not cheaper. It's not less expensive. It costs a lot of money to get all of the raw materials. So you don't want to just throw it away, but you know, I've got things that have been in the closet of shame for a really long time. And every once in a while I'll pull something out of the closet of shame and I'll go, oh my gosh, that project just needed belt loops. I was so close. But you know, you get to that point, it's like, I just can't take one more minute. And you push it aside. It's retrofitting that's painful. So how do we make it less painful? Well, let me just ask, is there any faculty member in here who set up a course and never went back and touched it again? No. None of us do that, right? We always go back, we edit, we make changes, we update. When you're updating, when you're making changes, now is the time to think again about, okay, let me do a little bit of it. I think one of the things that gets in the way of accessibility is we get into this sort of, you know, digital on-off, right, wrong kind of thinking where it's all or nothing. Oh, it's not 100% accessible, therefore I'm not even going to do a little bit. No. Find ways to make it easy for yourself. This semester, do a little bit more. Next semester, do a little bit more. Find ways to really give yourself a break on there. And the best case is think access first. So when you're in the design phase, when you're in the development phase, think about access at that point, and you're going to be amazed at how really easy it is. Now, I want to pull back kind of to the 10,000-foot level here and talk about this from a systemic, campus-wide perspective. We have 2 strategies for meeting the needs of individuals with disabilities. I call those access and accommodation. Access, when I'm talking about access, I'm talking about what is just there. It's like my old geometry teacher said, it's a given. It just is there. You don't have to ask for it. It just shows up. It's like curb cuts, ramps, elevators. You know, your students in wheelchairs, they don't call up your campus and go, thinking about coming to the campus in the fall, and like I wanted to check and see, do you have elevators? No, nobody has to do that. We know there will be elevators. That's what access is. It's just there. It doesn't matter if you ever have a student with a disability who uses it. There is actually a campus in California that I've visited that is so steep that they do not have students in wheelchairs who go to this campus. Literally, I mean, it is so steep that they have parking down below the campus. Students walk up this long driveway, and they walk up the middle of the driveway. There's no sidewalks. And I said to them, what's up with that? And I was told, well, it was considered too much risk to have a sidewalk because they're so steep. And I said, do you ever have students in wheelchairs? And she said, I think I've had one once about 10 years ago. Do they still have to have curb cuts? Do they still have to have ramps? Do they still have to have elevators? Absolutely, because that's part of that access, which is just a given. It's just there. It's the expected norm. So in access, when we're talking about technology, it means creating software that's accessible. If you are creating software apps, creating accessible websites, creating accessible videos, creating accessible documents. If you're creating an online course, making sure that's fully accessible. That is part of access. There's another part of it, which is looking at any time you're part of the decision making on a product that's going to be used, an electronic or information resource that's going to be used. Think about your learning software. Think about your My Math Lab, your Alex, your whatever kind of learning software, your Vista programs. Making sure that those are going to be usable by all students. When you're thinking about buying them, that way you don't get into those problems. That is a campus-wide responsibility, so everybody has a piece of that. And then making it work for an individual, that's the accommodation piece. That's where disability services comes into play. That is their job, is making it work for the individual. So I want to give you kind of a little bit more of an idea of how these 2 ideas work together, because it helps in understanding whose responsibility different aspects are, what your role might be into this process. So access and accommodation, on this little chart here, the blue and white striped bars, that's accommodation. The red with the dots, that's access. The idea here is that access and accommodation work together. It's a continuum, but you always meet the individual's needs 100%. So each of these bars goes all the way to the top. How much is accommodation? How much is access? The individual themselves doesn't really care. But from the perspective of the campus, the more the access is built in, the faster, the easier, and the less expensive it will be to provide the accommodation. So let me give you a couple of examples. So on the far left-hand side of the screen where we have just accommodation, think about a student who's blind, who's taking a course like geography. Very visual course, right? You've got maps, you've got landforms, you've got a lot of very visual elements. Well, a lot of those visual elements, there's not a whole lot of access we can build in with that. It's pretty minimal. So that's where there's going to be a lot of accommodation required for that student. The folks in disability services may have to make tactile graphics, which are graphics that somebody can feel with their fingertips. They may need to get 3D models. They're going to have to do a lot of extra work for that. Now, let's look at that other extreme. Say you have the same student who's blind is taking a Microsoft Word class. Now, Microsoft Word is a very accessible program, has a lot of access natively built in, but it doesn't talk. And so we add, as an accommodation, a piece of what's called assistive technology, specialized technology for individuals with disabilities, a piece of technology called a screen reader. And a screen reader, like its name implies, it reads to you everything, and I do mean everything. Seriously, when you're learning to use a screen reader, the first key you learn is the shut up key. It's the control key, by the way, in case you ever need that information. Shut up. So you can see that in the case of just having to add a piece of software that Disability Services already has access to, they can do that in an afternoon or a day or two. The geography class, clearly, that's going to be a lot of work. That's going to take weeks and weeks to do. So this is what we're talking about. The more you can build in the access, the part that's just there, the easier, the faster, and the less expensive it will be for Disability Services to come in and work with you to provide that extra little piece. Now, I know for some of you this is a new idea, and it kind of takes a little while to wrap your mind around it. So I'm going to give you an analogy I like to use. I call this the suit analogy. This is not the legal kind, it's the kind that we wear. So imagine you have a gentleman who wants to go buy a new suit, and he goes down to the department store, and he walks in, and the clerk says, oh, may I help you? And so then they go to the rack, and the gentleman might say, oh, I really like this navy blue suit. So then the clerk says, great, would you like to try it on? And I'll bring in the tailor. And of course, the tailor comes in, and the tailor does what tailors do. It's like, oh, your shoulders are a little bit different, arm lengths are a little bit different. We're not all perfect. Hopefully that's not news to anybody. But we have to make these little adjustments to make it work just for us, not for anybody else, but just for us. So in this analogy, buying off the rack, that's access. That's what's just there. You don't have to ask for it. You just walk in and you can just pick it up off the rack. The accommodation part, that's the additional tailoring. That's the making it work just for that one individual, not for anybody else, but just for that one person. So it's a continuum. Access and accommodation always work together. Sometimes people will say to me, well, is that access or is that accommodation? And the answer is always yes, because it's always both. You have some, sometimes very minimal, but you have some level of access, and then we're trying to fill in the gap with that. Where it gets to be an issue is those accommodations, they really need to be workable. And in legal terms, it's equally effective. Those accommodations, those one-offs that we're doing for the individuals, they need to be equally effective for that person. So what does equally effective mean? Well, it's very intuitive, actually. So if every other student can do this online course at home in their bunny slippers, but the student with a disability has to come into Disability Services office and say, oh gosh, is there somebody here who can help me with this? And of course, Disability Services, which is always very stretched, says, well, okay, come back at this time. We can get a student worker to work with you, and we'll figure out how to do that. Well, yes, that's an accommodation, but is it equally effective? which student would you rather be? I mean, would it be equally effective to you? It wouldn't be equally effective to me. I mean, nobody else has to go out in the rain and snow. They just get to sit at home. So that's what we're talking about here. Is it equally as inclusive, equally as easy to use, equally as available? Those are what equally effective are all about. So the accommodation needs to be equally effective. But where we really get into issues is there is some technology I cannot accommodate in even a slightly effective way. Forget equally effective. I can't even make it come close. And that's where we really get into problems. Because if you are requiring, and that's the key word here, if you are requiring students to use this piece of technology that they basically cannot use, we just sort of slammed the door in their face and said, oh, well, you poor person with a disability, I guess you just can't do whatever it might be. We're not legally allowed to do that. So in other words, if I cannot make that technology equally effective for all users, I cannot require it of all users. Now, there are specialized sorts of programs. Think something like Photoshop or Illustrator or InDesign. These are all programs, they're not accessible. You have to use a mouse. Anytime you have to use a mouse, by definition, the program's not going to be fully accessible. But those are not programs that are required of all students. Not everyone has to take them. Now, obviously, if you're a graphics art major, you will have to take those. And if you have somebody who is taking graphic arts, who has a disability where they cannot use a mouse, that's where Disability Services will get involved. They will work with you as an instructor. They will try to find an equally effective accommodation for working with those programs. And this is where, as faculty members, your student learning outcomes become so critical. Because literally, Disability Services will sit down with you and say, what is the learning outcome this student is meant to get from this course? Is the learning outcome how to click the mouse? Not typically. Usually the learning outcome is how to run the program. Okay, let's see if we can find a way to do the same thing in a different way. One of the things you have to be careful of is thinking as an instructor, oh, I could not do this course if I were blind, deaf, quadriplegic, whatever it might be. We can't really use ourselves as the test case there because we haven't spent the time learning the compensatory strategies. I mean, honestly, for most of us, you would think that somebody who's totally blind would never be able to do anything because most of us stumble around even when it's dark and there's a little bit of light. You learn how to compensate for those sorts of things. We all have things we compensate for in our own lives. We've learned how to do that. An individual with a disability learns how to do that. So the issue is when it's something like math or English or something that everybody has to take. Now we're in a real danger zone because if we're requiring in those kinds of courses something that is not accessible and we cannot accommodate it, that's where we really have the big issues around lawsuits and a lot of complaints around those sorts of things. So, just to summarize this, so with access, which is the, what's built in, what's just there, you don't have to ask for it, it's just available when you show up. We're talking about accessible documents, accessible software and apps, accessible websites, and then in purchasing, that's when we have to look at what are we adopting in the purchasing phase so we don't get into those bad situations. And then accommodate, whatever we do have, accommodate that as necessary. So looking at these two ideas of access and accommodation, it helps us to understand where you might fall in this sort of equation here. So if you are creating anything that's going online, if you're creating any electronic or information resources, you're creating ebooks, you're creating a course, or you're involved with making decisions about purchasing hardware, software, learning objects, that kind of thing, then you're going to fall on the access side of equation. And that's going to be your part, is to learn about what that means. If you're making it work for one person, then you're going to be accommodating that individual, and that is the accommodation phase. For most of us on campus, we only get into the accommodation phase if you have a student with a disability and if Disability Services comes to you and says, you know, we're going to need your help to understand what we need to do. They will do a lot of the work, but they're going to need your input on what needs to be done, because we don't know that. We don't know your subject area. We don't know, is this map important? Is that map important? We can't tell that. So that's where you need to work with us to help us understand that. So let me give you some concrete examples here. Graphics. Any sort of graphics that you are putting into your course, into a document, into a PowerPoint, into your agenda, onto your flyer, whatever it might be, if it's meant to be distributed electronically or online, it needs to have a brief description. We call that an alternative text description, or an alt text description, or an alternate text description. A lot of different ways of talking about it. Unfortunately, all of the terminology tends to have the word description in it, which makes my job a lot harder. Because when I use the word description with somebody who's sighted, your mind goes to, what does it look like? No, not what we're talking about. I don't care what it looks like. I want to know, what is it? That is the question you're answering. It's really, what is it? It's just a label. I've had faculty members in STEM fields say to me, you know, I'm okay with the rest of accessibility, but I just hate labeling the graphics. As soon as somebody says that to me, I know you've slipped beyond access into accommodation. Because the access piece, you don't need to do a huge amount of description. I just want to know, what is it? It's the Krebs cycle. It's the water cycle. You know, it's DNA replication. It's osmosis. You don't need to do a huge verbal description of that, because that's what you're doing in the course. That's what you're doing in the surrounding text. That's what's in the textbook. I just need to know, is this graphic something that's important enough for me to ask people in Disability Services about it? That's the accommodation piece. That's not your job, unless they come and specifically say, what do I need to know about this graphic? Well, then obviously, then you would interact with the student. But for most of what you need, usually 12 words or fewer is all you need on your alt text description. And that helps us in Disability Services, because if I look at something and go, I don't know what this is, you know, maybe it's, I don't know what the Krebs cycle is. Is that an important thing? How come it's spelled with a K and not a C? I mean, I don't know. But if I know what it's called, then I can go out and I can go into, there's actually repositories of tactographics. I can go in, I can search, I can say, oh, look, somebody's already done that. Woohoo! All I have to do is make a tactile image. So it saves us a huge amount of time if you've done your work of labeling those graphics. So is this making sense to people? I think the reason that it gets so scary is because, and this is not just on the faculty side, but I think it gets scary on both sides, because we start drifting into the other person's job. I think a lot of people who really just need to be doing the access piece are thinking, oh my gosh, I have to know how a student who's blind, deaf, quadriplegic learns. No, you just have to put a label on your graphic. That's it. Just a few word label. What is it? That's it. That's all. That's we're not asking you for the accommodation piece. Somebody else does that job. Conversely, in Disability Services, I get this course and I'm looking at all these graphics that don't have any labels on them, and I'm going, I don't know what the expectation is here. I don't know which of these is important. I don't even know what it is sometimes. If I've never taken the course, it's like I'm clueless. I don't even know how to look it up. I don't know where to begin. So it's really going to allow everybody to relax a lot if you just take your area and handle your area. So let's talk about documents for a minute. A lot of you are working Microsoft Word. A lot of you are probably working in PowerPoint. It's actually very easy to make either of those accessible. And then you can, this is beautiful. When you save it to a PDF, as long as you don't print to PDF, you're making a lot of PDFs, don't print to PDF, do save as, there's one of the programs, I think it's export or convert. Just don't do print. Print takes away all the accessibility stuff. Print is great if you're actually wanting to print, but otherwise use the save as features. Once you learn how to follow a simple list, and this is something I'm going to be working with your designers to learn about, it's really easy. There's just like 4 or 5 simple steps that you have to do to make your course accessible. Not hard at all. But in the meantime, until you learn how to do that, your easy button is don't just post your PDF and your original source document. be it Word, be it PowerPoint. If you're a STEM teacher, LaTeX. I love LaTeX as a starting point. LaTeX is a great source document for me going out to Braille, going out to large print, whatever. PDF? Yeah, not so much. I literally, in Disability Services, have to convert the PDF back into something I can use. So if you post both of them, that's going to save everybody a lot of time. I know that sometimes faculty say to me, well, I don't want to post a Word document because you can copy from it. And by the way, tip, you can copy from the PDF too. It's actually really super easy. But Word and PowerPoint, if you go into your file menu, it's a big button for security under your file menu. You can set permissions and you can say, don't copy this. You can lock it down so that you, honestly, if you know what you're doing, you can make your Word documents more secure than you can your PDF. Your PDF, about all you can do is password protected. You don't have a lot of other options. But with Word, you actually have quite a few options. And then Disability Services will take it beyond that. If the student needs Braille, if they need an MP3, if they need a Kurzweil file, if they need large print, that will be their job. You're making their life a lot easier if you give them something that they can start with that works really well. And then scanning, I want to mention. Your campus, and I believe this is going to be happening, will provide a tool that will allow, if you're scanning an article, scanning part of a book, something that you want to put into your online course, we would ask that you run it through an optical character recognition program. It's OCR, optical character recognition program, that will take it and make it searchable text. So it's still a PDF, that's fine, but now it is searchable text. And what the cool thing about that is, if you want to pull a quote out of that you're going to use in your course, you just copy and paste it. You don't have to retype any of it because it's already text. So the program I'm recommending is Abby FineReader, and I think that that's probably going to happen where you get some copies of that. And it does a beautiful job on tables. If you're in any of the fields where you have data tables, and oh my gosh, it just, boom, run it through, you're good. You got a beautiful table. Wonderful program. So that is my recommendation, to provide a basic level of access, and then, again, Disability Services can take it farther than that. So just to kind of summarize this, so for faculty, your major role is going to be in access, learning how to make those accessible documents, learning how to make your accessible course. And then it will be up to your Disability Services folks to determine what the accommodation is. Now, if you ever do have a student with a disability in your class, we will want to work closely with you if it's a student with a severe disability. So if you have someone who's blind, for instance, there will be a lot of information that we're going to be asking from you to help us know how to help the student. So, but that's not going to be you doing the work so much, it's going to be you working with us. Although I have to tell you, because again, working with students who are blind and visually impaired is my background and what I've been doing for so long, I have yet to have a faculty member who had a blind student in their class who did not at the end of it say, you know, that was one of the best experiences of my entire career. Why? Because you have to think about your course differently. You have to get out of your own box and think, oh my gosh, how can I explain this differently? What can I do here? And it ends up being really kind of an exciting experience. I mean, I hope that you're teaching something you really like. And so it's actually a way that you kind of get to deepen into your subject in a whole different way and look at it in a whole different way, and especially for those of us who've been kind of doing the same thing mostly. And let's face it, what do we change every year on our syllabus? Not much. You know? And you do that enough years, and then somebody comes along, you have to think about it in a new way. It's kind of exciting. It really is. So, for the creation part on your materials, again, that's access. You'll learn how to create accessible documents, your online courses, how to make those accessible. Videos do need to be captioned. But I do want to say one thing about captioning. Captioning is honestly one of the best examples of the added value of universal design. There have been a lot of studies now, and they were done years ago, and then they've been redone, and consistently what they've found is when you're learning new vocabulary, seeing and hearing the words at the same time, increases retention enormously. and especially if you're in a field that's very dense with terminology, which is mostly any of the STEM fields. You got all those new words that people haven't seen before. It just makes such a difference when they see and hear it at the same time for learning that vocabulary. And that's one of the things captioning does for you. The other thing that captioning does for you, because it's part of the process of captioning, you create a transcript. Now you have that transcript both as a study tool and for any of your students who are English language learners or have English as a second language, they can run that through Google Translate, and that can help them also to understand it in a whole different way. So it's just such a great example of universal design. It is some work. I'm not going to deny that. It's definitely some work. But it is really a great, great tool for learning. And then the last one here, learning to verbalize. That sounds easy, doesn't it? This is where you learn to describe what you're doing in any of the videos as you're doing it. Yeah, that doesn't sound that hard, does it? But yeah, it's a lot harder than you think. We tend to be a little lazy verbally. I didn't know about any of you, but I love watching PBS and all the British shows. They use so many more words that are part of the English language than most of us do. We get lazy. We say king and there. Get that thing over there. If I'm not looking when you do that, I have no clue what you're talking about. Now, obviously, if the person is blind, that's a problem. But you know what? It's a problem for all of us. I don't know if any of you have ever taken a computer class and you're trying to figure out where was that thing and the instructor's saying, okay, just click here and do this. It's like, what? And now, like with my closet of shame, they're on to step 7 and I still am back at step 5 and I can't catch up because I don't know where they are anymore. Learning to verbalize is going to be of benefit to all of your students. Absolutely essential for a student who's blind, but it helps all of your students to be able to understand what you're talking about. I teach computers a lot because I teach how to make accessible documents, how to make an accessible Word document. I've had to train myself over time to say, okay, we're going to go to the File menu, and then there's this big button here on the left side, check for issues, really clearly verbalize and recognize it takes some processing time. So it's not easy. I had one faculty member say that she was really dense. She really wanted to do this. She could see, oh my gosh, this is going to help all of my students so much. So she recorded the video. She thought she'd done a great job. She went back and she watched it, and she said, I was so embarrassed. It takes some practice. I'm not going to lie to you. It takes some practice, but it will improve your teaching enormously. It really will. As purchasers, if you are part of choosing any learning software or any materials that are going to be used in your course or in your department, think about accessibility. And one of the things that you can do is when you're talking to vendors, okay, so here's the question you do not ask. Is it accessible? Do not ask this. Because the answer is always going to be, yeah, it's accessible. Really? I think they must have their fingers crossed behind their backs. I mean, seriously. I've actually had people who've been part of lawsuits because their programs were not accessible say, oh yeah, it's accessible. No, it's not. So what can you ask instead? Can your software be used without a mouse? Can your software be used without a mouse? Think about it. Somebody who's blind cannot use a mouse. Now, okay, I do have people argue with me about this. It baffles me a little bit, but yes, you can click on it. Your toddler can click on it and probably does if you haven't put it out of reach. So will your cat, by the way. Anybody stepping on things? So yeah, that's not the point. You have to know what you're clicking on. And if you can't see what you're clicking on, you can't use the mouse. Students who have quadriplegia often cannot use a mouse, or they have to be, sometimes they'll have these head mice. It's a sip and puff kind of thing. It takes a huge amount of time for those students to go through their material. So that's the first thing. Can it be used without a mouse? And then is all of the text really text and not a picture of text? Assistive technology can't read a picture. It needs to be actual individual characters. By the way, one way to check this often is if you can take that mouse and highlight that text and get individual characters, that is a very strong indicator that you have actual text. If it won't select it, that's a good indicator it's not going to be something that your assistive technology can read either. Are all of the interactive fields understandable? So in other words, if somebody has to be working with a form, with a drop-down list, that kind of thing, can they do that? Is it going to respond to them? And also, will it announce what it is? If it just tells them that it's an empty field, well, is it a name field? Is it a date field? I don't know what it is unless it announces to me what it is. And then, are the videos captioned? Those 4 simple questions, that's something that you can just, work with your department whenever you're deciding on software. Just ask them, have these conversations. And that will give you a lot more information than that dreaded, is it accessible question, because that's not going to get you much. So just to sort of summarize this, access is a campus responsibility. Now, I'm very impressed with what TWU has done so far in terms of the general level of proactive interest that I'm seeing on this campus for accessibility, which I just really applaud you guys for, because I don't see that everywhere. But you've gotten past the no, we don't want to stage to the okay, how do we do it stage, which is great. That's absolutely fabulous. It is not all disability services responsibility. I've gone to campuses and they just say, well, disability services will take care of it. Disability services already has a huge job. They're the tailors, right? It takes a lot longer for the tailor to do their work than the clerk who's lifting the suit off the rack. They don't have time to do both. The tailor's not out there selling this stuff. So if you kind of keep that analogy in mind, it will help. It's the whole campus that needs to be worried about the access piece, just like with facilities. Disability services does not go out with the jackhammers to put in a curb cut. Not their job. Oh, it might be kind of fun sometimes. Oh, I can just pound this thing here. So that's that structural access piece. We're talking about electronic information, but it's the same idea. We're looking at that structural piece of what's just there. Anybody who's making decisions on technology purchases, that access piece is part of what you do. And all of you who are creating documents, web pages, emails, videos, any of those sorts of things, that access piece is part of what you do. And then the accommodation piece, disability services will handle that for students. And usually it's human resources that handles that for employees. We tend to be very student-focused on colleges, so I tend to talk in terms of students, but just know everything I'm saying about students applies to employees as well. And one of the things that I like to remind people about when it comes to these laws, and by the way, these are civil rights laws. I actually heard a college president say, well, it's not like it's a civil rights law. Yeah, actually it is. It is exactly like that because that is what it is. It is a civil rights law. It's about equity, it's about access, it's about inclusion. But you may not currently be part of what's called a protected class. In other words, a class that has these protections under the civil rights law. But you will be, if you live long enough, you will most likely have a disability. So this is not stuff that's for other people. This is stuff that's for all of us. All of us.